I see this comment all over the internet. Uh-oh, she's showing her ankles. Victorian women couldn't show ankle, it was too scandalous. It's like people genuinely think that in the Victorian era, every time a woman's ankle was in view, men were straight up getting heart attacks because it was just too sexy to handle. Some random lady is walking down the street, minding her own business, and oops, here's a situation in which an ankle must be shown, and because ankles are just too spicy, the surrounding men simply cannot contain themselves. Sure, these comments are usually jokes, but in truth, jokes are often how our conceptions of history get blown out of proportion and lose nuance or context. Karolina Zebrowska made a great video talking about women's history myths and discussed the sexy ankle thing. The video's great, so definitely check it out if you haven't already. But considering how pervasive this idea is, I want to take a closer look at this myth in particular. What did the Victorians really think about ankles and why? But before we explore the world of sexy ankles, let's hear a word from today's sponsor, Skillshare. I'm always looking for new ways to learn, especially from other creators. So I'm so excited that Skillshare is sponsoring this video, because I absolutely love them. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes to choose from. They have super inspiring topics like illustration, film and video, creative writing, and much more. I've been really enjoying the writing and video production classes, especially creative writing, crafting professional essays with impact taught by Roxanne Gay. The class is really helping me refine my writing skills in ways that I'd never thought about before. It's so fun just going through all the classes and seeing so many amazing creators that I've heard of before sharing their knowledge. Skillshare is curated specifically for learning, meaning that there are no ads, and they're always launching new premium classes so you can stay focused and follow your creativity wherever it takes you. Whether you've been honing your craft for years or are brand new to creating, there's definitely going to be something there for you. The first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare so you can start exploring your creativity today. Seriously, check it out. Thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning about sexy Victorian ankles. So, did the Victorians think ankles are sexy? Tragically, this doesn't have an easy answer. But this idea actually contradicts another pervasive concept that we have today about the Victorians, that they were all prudish snobs who weren't allowed to talk about or desire sex, especially women. This is almost completely false. Noted rat from the sewer, Queen Victoria herself, was very explicit in her diaries about how hot Albert was, and all sorts of other things. Listen, I'm gonna be kind of roundabout in this video because I don't want to get demonetized, so bear with me. But it really says something that the camera was invented and almost immediately people started making corn. Really, really risque corn. However, this doesn't mean that the Victorians weren't also sexually repressed. Social convention for all of the classes, but especially the middle and upper classes, demanded certain rules for social interactions and conversation. We'll get into that a little more later. The Victorians had a very strong idea of sexual morality, because of course they did. And most of Victorian society had specific social conventions for nearly everything, especially for those of the middle and upper classes. A lot of people found these rules to be comforting rather than necessarily restrictive, because some people thrive under rules that help you understand exactly how to act in any given situation. It makes it easier to know what to do, but the same rules that provide comfort to some are cages to others. And the fact is, no matter how strong social conventions are in any given era of history, literally every single person will break one or more of those rules at some point, or ignore most of them altogether, because people are never, ever a monolith. There are always people who question things or pick and choose what rules to follow. If you were a member of the working class, this was a lot more common. If you were a member of the middle and upper classes, you had less wiggle room with regards to social rules, but appearance was always more important. If you could cover up or hide something, and many wealthy people could certainly afford to, or had the connections to, you could get away with it. As Russell M. Goldfarb wrote in his sometimes questionable book book, Sexual Repression in Victorian Literature, the truth is, of course, the Victorian age was obsessed with hiding sex. And this obsession accounts for the extraordinary pressures the age brought to bear upon society to satisfy its compulsion. If sexual expression could be hidden deeply enough, if it could be successfully repressed, completely repressed, then one could speak easily and apparently without guilt of being respectful. That guilt was particularly potent, because the one thing you couldn't hide from was God, the eyes of God. Christianity's grip on Victorian morality was iron strong, and it was used to inform and justify the social rules that appeared during the era. To be an observant Christian was one of the most important aspects of Victorian respectability in many cases. It infiltrated everything, in part due to the steep rise in independent evangelical social groups that sought to control and police various aspects of society and protect people from vice. They advocated for wholesome literature, worked to shut down all books and periodicals deemed sexually explicit, and encouraged employers to hand out Bibles to employees. Doctors often promoted the ideas that certain sexual acts would cause illness or bodily weakness and lead to mental disturbance. But to think that these beliefs were completely universal, or that the reach of these influences was always effective, is not wholly accurate. Pornography itself flowed constantly from hand to hand in Victorian society in various forms. But I do need to make clear that these moral outsider undercurrents were the exceptions and not the rules. Media and behavior following social rules was obviously still completely dominant and vastly more visible. Again, social convention controls every era in its own forms. But my point is, just because you don't necessarily see something doesn't mean it isn't there. As much as a society ever tries to deny its own sexuality, it will always grow weak at the hands of human nature, and the innate human desire to never be completely told what to do. And even the Victorians themselves were often capable of recognizing when an idea had strayed into ridiculousness. Not all the time, but often. And yet, we really want a simple and easy to understand image of history that will make us feel superior to our ancestors in certain ways. So, frequently, people, even trained historians, will take minor bizarre cases that some people did and talk about them as if everyone in the era was doing it. That's how we end up with the false idea that all Victorians were covering the legs of pianos because they looked too much like sexy lady legs, or that Victorian parents never ever educated their children about puberty or sex, even though we know that they absolutely usually did, just in a different way from the way we do today. As Matthew Sweet writes in Inventing the Victorians, that old chestnut about draped piano legs is quoted with even greater regularity. The Victorians, the orthodox view goes, were so afraid of the power of sexuality that they felt compelled to cover up the legs of their pianos. They obscured signs of the body, even where they existed, only by inference. It has become the perfect exemplum of their prudishness, cited with impressive regularity in both popular and scholarly writings. The voice of this particular appearance, however, is an act of historical ventriloquism. There is no evidence that the custom was ever practiced in the period, except as a means of protecting valued furniture from damage, in much the same way that antimacassars defended upholstery from dirt and hair cream. He goes on to recount how the piano legs myth was perpetuated in the 40s as a method of reinventing the image of the Victorians. Nearly every mention we have from the 1800s mentioning furniture legs being covered for prudish reasons was written as satire or as a joke. You can see the same exact thing when people post-Edwardian era discuss Victorian or Edwardian corsets, despite women having worn some sort of shapewear ever since anyways. But this social revisionism is a permanent truth of each generation. The Victorians were guilty of it too. In a desperate bid to feel superior to their ancestors, many writers, scholars, and scientists of the Victorian era made up blatant lies about the medieval era to make medieval people out to be dirty, stupid, and worthless, and look how much better and smarter we are. The Victorian ideas of the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages persist in our common knowledge today, and then in the cultural upheaval of the 1920s, in yet another bid to feel superior, you started seeing people making jokes about how stuffy, prudish, and repressed the Victorians were, follower, which is exactly where a lot of our common ideas about the Victorian era came from. In fact, one of the books that I found that mentioned scandalous revealed ankles the most was actually published in 1933, Unmentionables from Fig Leaves to Scanties by Robert Cortez Holliday. Books and scholarship writing on Victorian etiquette and fashion hammer in this idea all the way up until fairly recently. It goes on and on, of course. Every generation wants to feel smarter than the last, when usually in reality, the same problems have just been recycled into new and more contemporarily palatable forms. So, what the hell does this have to do with ankles? Well, in the age of the internet, we all know that literally anything, and I mean anything, that exists can and will, and probably has been, made into corn. Every body part, then, can be considered attractive or considered erotic. But what is culturally considered erotic depends on the time and place. Frequently, non-sexual body parts can be made sexual by society simply by their implication of another body part. This is why anyone who lived childhood being perceived as a girl knows the awful experience of being told to not wear a tank top because the sight of bra straps on the shoulders is just too provocative. It's not that the shoulders are necessarily sexy on their own, it's the implication that this person also has boobage. Or why schools require shorts that at least reach past your fingertips, because thighs imply that you also own, God forbid, a butt. Some scholars believe that this may have been what the fuss about ankles was about for the Victorians. If you have a pair of ankles, you must have a pair of legs. And if you have a pair of legs, well, you might have, oh god, a vagoinus. Quick, somebody call the National Guard. But here's the thing about that. If ankles were truly considered so provocative that the mere sight of them could send a man into a tailspin of sinful thoughts, it would certainly be pretty dangerous for men and women to, I don't know, be existing. It's not like men were the only ones walking around outside or moving at all. Women were getting around, walking upstairs, walking through mud and puddles, dancing, getting into carriages, doing sports. In the theater, it was almost universal to see not only a lady's ankles, but all of her legs. Does God stop watching while you're in the theater? Do people stop thinking dirty thoughts? To be fair, evangelical groups were vehemently against theater for this reason exactly, and yet the popularity of theater persisted in the masses. It just goes to show that people will always pick and choose where and when they want to follow the rules. But back to the previous point, yeah, men were seeing lady ankles all the time. And it's not like they were gasping for air every time. But it's still also true that ankles were considered attractive. So let's explore that, because there's a big difference. The Victorian era had many books that had a long, long list of visual keys for what makes an attractive woman. And a lot of the time it got utterly ridiculous, like Harriet Hubbard Ayer's etiquette book from 1902, detailing the numerical proportions an ideal woman must have. Books that did this were extremely common through the Victorian era because the ideal of the perfect woman was so pervasive. She must be the angel of the home, a good Christian, slender in the right places, a good mother, a good cook, a devoted wife, and, white. Very white. How many women actually fit all of these rules? Hardly any, and everyone knew it. But many women bought these books anyway, because these ideals were aspirational, much in the same way that many women today will follow a long list of beautiful models on Instagram, internalizing the slim, thick body ideal of right now, and everything that follows, knowing deep down that these women have the money to buy that face and that body, and many of them still edit their photos, and yet, the desire to look like that, to have that life, is so powerful because they must be so happy. If you can't be them, you can at least imitate most of them. These etiquette books had rules for everything, and ankles are actually not mentioned very frequently. When they are, it's typically in passages saying that you must only pick up your skirt to just above the ankle when going through a muddy street, and to never pick up the skirt with both hands because that is what's unacceptable. It also implies that the ankle is not the issue here, but rather the rest of the leg. There was a lot of upper-class social unease and consciousness in the era about the woman's body and movement in general, as if purely existing could be provocative enough. In 1893, Lady Colin Campbell wrote in the Etiquette of Good Society, In the house, a woman is allowed much less freedom of posture than a man. He may change his position in an infinity of ways, lounge and loll, cross his legs, do anything but sit on the edge of his chair or clasp his hands around his knee. But a woman must sit still. Not so much mentions of sexy angles being the problem specifically, but rather the problem of being assigned female at birth and just kind of existing. There still is a lot of mention in Victorian etiquette books and literature of a woman's well-turned ankle, which usually means that the ankle is slender and nicely shaped. If a woman has a pretty and slender ankle in a society that dictates she must have them, and they're considered attractive, you obviously end up with some men that ogle at ankles when they see them. But I think that the missing piece of the equation here is intent. Today, body parts like the ankle or shoulders or even midriff are hardly exciting in a casual context. Anyone walking around with these parts showing may get a few looks, but it's not a scandal. Well, depending on where you live. However, if someone moves their clothes aside to purposely show these areas in a provocative way, it's obviously considered provocative because that's the intent. It was kind of a similar situation with Victorian ankles. A woman picking up her skirt to walk upstairs, and a woman pulling back her skirt in a social setting to bare a silk stockinged ankle are two drastically different situations. The Victorian era had a lot of rules for what clothing was acceptable and when. For example, it was normal for day wear to have high necklines and longer sleeves, but evening wear, especially at the end of the 19th century, left a lot more room for revealing outfits that didn't hide much at all. It all depends on context. All that said, I need to talk about classism now. I've mentioned it a few times, but have you noticed that a lot of this feels very rich people issues? Because obviously, the rigid rules for dress propriety applied far more to the upper class than the working class for numerous reasons. The wealthy wanted to have a lot of rules to insulate their own culture and differentiate themselves from the uncultured riffraff underclass. There were drastically different dress rules between classes, especially towards the first part of the 1800s. It was very much frowned upon to dress above your class. And when it came to people of color, especially enslaved people, they were often restricted from wearing the same garment styles or even often the same fabrics as their white counterparts. So working class people and people of color lived a very different lifestyle from the white wealthy people. They had more physically demanding jobs, and yes, women worked too. Women worked very physical jobs, so to think that these working women could be wearing long skirts reaching the ground literally makes no sense. Rarely, working women even sometimes wore pants. Not only that, but working class families often lived in multi-generational homes or had a lot of kids and had to live with a lot of people sleeping in the same room. So, to be frank, sexy, scandalous ankles being seen by men were really not much of a concern for the working class. But polite society had a lot more time to be in a fuss over small things, and to be focusing a lot more on the virtuousness of their women. Upper-class women's education frequently had an emphasis on manners and how to present oneself properly as a lady, because how well you presented yourself in high society determined your chance of landing a well-off husband who could take care of you and merge family assets in a beneficial way. Marriage in history has long been a financial endeavor after all. In high society, with so much competition in courtship, it's no wonder then that rules for how to present yourself can end up becoming a runaway train. So these Victorian etiquette books were primarily designed for upper class people, usually women, which becomes quickly apparent when they start dictating how to act towards your servants or what to do at balls and fine dinners. And many of the things that these books say not to do are specifically things that may make you appear to be acting below your class. You wouldn't want to look poor, would you? Better not grab your skirt with both hands, or laugh at your own jokes. As Michael Curtin explains, the purpose of their advice was to fit a class set out by birth to play a major role in the state, with the manners and virtues to do the job properly. Interest in manners was closely tied to the expansion of London in the 18th century. In some ways, courtesy books may be viewed as a means by which a country family prepared itself for a visit to the capital. The central dichotomy in the 18th century discussions of manners was not, as it became in the 19th century, between the aristocracy and the middle class, but rather between urbanity and provincialism. There's a lot to be said here about how these etiquette books reflected Victorian society at large. These books were typically written by and for women, with increasingly demanding rules for the home, because it was expected that women's jobs were to make the home so pure, so perfect, so domestic, that your husband would prefer to be home than to the corrupting influences of pubs and social clubs, where they obviously would cheat and engage in sinful activity because their wives weren't good enough wives. In an environment like this, where women have so little power, it's no wonder then that they focus harder on the few things they do have power over. They can control other women, rewrite the rules, and add more until none of it makes any sense at all. So it's also important to take these books with a grain of salt, because very often they contradict each other, or even themselves. Humans then were still human, and so no one could possibly follow all of these rules perfectly, or never question any of them. Rather than looking at these lists of do's and don'ts as things all Victorians did, we have to remember that they were more like guides, and there were more specific, widespread rules that people always followed, and more vague, general social ideals that didn't necessarily tell someone what to do, but certainly influenced their decisions by influencing the ways that people viewed the world. This is the issue that I have with defining history by the antics of the wealthy. I see it everywhere, in articles and peer-reviewed books alike. People take a look at the rich and powerful of history and think that that's all there is to see, because that's who left behind the artifacts that we have. It's the reason why in school we're taught history on a timeline of wars. The trail of time that we follow often isn't about the fine details of everyday life, the stories that remind us that these people aren't all that different from ourselves, but instead about the great actions of battle and politics and all the silly, stupid things that those idiot historical people used to do that we're too smart for now. So what we're left with at the end of the day is a handful of icons to idolize and a vague population of caricatures. I guess what I want you to take away from all this is that all eras of history are a lot more nuanced than we're led to believe. Many of our ideas about the Victorian era are absolutely true. Women were expected at large to look and act a certain way, most ways to engage with sexuality were considered immoral and wrong, and people of all social standings had a slew of social expectations to live up to, with great consequences for failing those expectations unless you could afford or had the privilege to fail. And yes, slender ankles were considered attractive, but there's always more to it when you look at the details that make up the bigger picture. Oftentimes, things we hear about history end up being jokes that inflate it into something completely wrong, or we lose the nuance that makes something true, or we laugh at something people of history did or thought, while completely ignoring the different way we do the exact same thing today. It makes us feel better about the rotten world we've made for ourselves to laugh at people of the past. And what can I say? A lot of the time I like to laugh at them too. There's a lot of stuff to laugh at, or judge them for, that's for sure. I've done it before and I'll do it again. But overall, we also need to remind ourselves of just how much history we'll never know. How much context is lost to time because it was lost, destroyed, or thought not good enough to preserve. So much of what we have today is the stuff that rich people had the money to keep around. Let's just hope that our lives now don't end up the same way, because I sure as hell don't want to be defined by the clowns we call our celebrities today. Thank you so much for listening to my ramblings about sexy ankles. If you made it this far, I just know that you have the most beautiful ankles of them all. Listen, this video is not to shame anyone who makes the ankles joke. I mean, hell, I've made that joke too, mostly in reference to a specific art piece, but still. I just find it interesting to dissect these odd, overarching ideas we have about history, because usually when you look deeper, it's a lot different than you first think. Thank you again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. So, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and go flash some ankle at your partner, or just yourself in the mirror.